For 623 years, the Ottoman Empire refused to die, and the reason it survived that long is one of the most brutal, calculated, and counterintuitive governing decisions in all of human history. From 1299 to 1922, the Ottomans outlasted virtually every other political system on the planet. 6 centuries of continuous rule across 3 continents, through plagues, wars, revolutions, and the rise and fall of every European empire that existed during the same period. The secret was not religion, not military genius, not geography. It was a deliberate system built around a single, horrifying idea: that the safest way to transfer power was to kill every alternative at the exact moment of succession. And then, in 1603, they reformed that system out of moral concern and set the clock ticking on the empire's eventual collapse. In this video, we are going to go through exactly how the Ottoman succession system worked, why fratricide was considered the rational choice for centuries, what the Kafes system that replaced it actually produced, and why the moment they stopped executing princes was the moment the empire began losing the executive capacity it needed to survive. To understand why the Ottomans built this system in the first place, you need to understand what happened to almost every other dynasty that did not have one. Succession crisis was the single most predictable failure mode of dynastic states across Europe, Asia, and the Islamic world. When a king, emperor, or caliph died, multiple sons or close relatives would often claim the throne simultaneously, raise private armies, and fight civil wars that could kill tens of thousands of people and destabilize the state for generations. The Safavid dynasty, the Timurid Empire, the Mughals, the Byzantine Empire, the French Capetians, and the Holy Roman Empire all experienced devastating succession wars at various points. Conflicts that consumed resources, invited foreign invasion, and in several cases triggered permanent territorial losses. The Ottoman system was built specifically to prevent this, and it did so with a logic that is deeply uncomfortable but genuinely hard to argue against on its own terms. From roughly the reign of Mehmed I onward, consolidated into formal practice by Mehmed II after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453, Ottoman law gave a newly crowned sultan the right, and in practice, the duty, to execute his own brothers at the moment of his accession, not metaphorically, not symbolically, physically, immediately, and completely, often including infants and small children, sometimes dozens in a single act. The rationale was coldly practical. Multiple living princes meant multiple potential rallying points for anyone who wanted to challenge the new sultan's authority: a disgruntled janissary commander, a foreign power looking for a puppet, a regional governor with ambitions. Remove them all in one controlled act at the moment of succession, and the civil war that would otherwise unfold over years of competing claims is preempted entirely. The strongest textual evidence for how the system worked comes from the chronicler Lutfi Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier under Suleiman the Magnificent, and from later Ottoman legal commentaries that treated the practice as legitimate policy rather than aberration. By the reign of Mehmed III, who ruled from 1574 to 1595, the fratricidal succession had reached its maximum scale. Mehmed's own accession involved the execution of 5 brothers. His son Mehmed III, ascending the throne in 1595, executed 19 brothers on his accession day, the largest single fratricidal act in the dynasty's entire history, and several of the victims were small children. Contemporary descriptions record that the princes were strangled with silk bowstrings inside the inner chambers of Topkapi Palace, a detail that is both historically precise and almost impossible to sit with comfortably. And yet, from Mehmed I through Mehmed III, across roughly 2 centuries of this practice, the Ottoman Empire experienced essentially 0 succession civil wars. the exact outcome the system was designed to produce. While European dynasties were tearing themselves apart over inheritance disputes, the Ottomans transferred power cleanly, brutally, and effectively, generation after generation. Then in 1603, Sultan Ahmed I ascended the throne after his father's death, and he had a younger brother named Mustafa who was 11 years old. Ahmed declined to execute him. Instead, he confined Mustafa to a section of the Topkapi Palace inner quarters called the Kafes, a Turkish word meaning cage, where royal heirs would live in controlled comfort and complete isolation from the outside world. No political decisions, no military commands, no contact with officials, governors, or foreign dignitaries, no education in statecraft or administration, just a confined life inside the palace walls, surrounded by servants, for however many years or decades the sitting sultan remained alive. The Kafes system preserved the singular succession of the old one. Only one heir could take power at a time, without the bloodshed that had made the fratricide system politically and morally untenable. Religious scholars had been increasingly vocal in their opposition to the executions. Public sentiment had been eroded by the sheer scale of the 1,595 killings, and the combination of the Selali rebellions inside Anatolia and the long Turkish war against the Habsburgs had left the empire in no condition for internal controversy. The Kafes solved the immediate political problem, and it created a slow-motion catastrophe that would unfold across the next 3 centuries. Because what the Kafes produced, year after year and decade after decade, was sultans who had never made a single real decision before the day they were handed the most powerful throne in the Islamic world. Mehmed Roman IV spent most of his adolescence in the Kafes before ascending the throne. Ibrahim spent 23 years inside the Kafes, more than 2 decades of total isolation, before becoming sultan, and his reign was marked by behavior that contemporary sources describe in terms that suggest severe psychological damage from the confinement. Mustafa I spent 2 separate periods in the Kafes, totaling nearly 20 years. These men entered the sultanate with no political training, no command experience, no diplomatic relationships, no language skills beyond palace conversation, and no personal authority over the senior officials and janissary commanders who had been running the empire in their name while they were confined. The power vacuum at the top of the Ottoman system was filled, systematically and often brilliantly, by the women of the imperial household, the mothers, wives, and senior concubines of confined and incompetent sultans. The formal historical period known as the Sultanate of Women covers roughly the late 16th through mid-17th century, during which figures including Hurrem Sultan, Nurbanu Sultan, Safiye Sultan, and most significantly Kursum Sultan exercised direct political control over Ottoman policy. Kursum Sultan, originally a Greek girl who entered the imperial household through the Devshirme system, is the most extraordinary single example of what the Kafes era produced in terms of alternative power centers. She exercised direct political influence, formally or informally, under the reigns of Mehmed Roman IV, Ibrahim, and the young Mehmed Roman IV, beginning in 1623 and ending only with her assassination in 1651. A political career spanning 28 years across 3 separate sultans, 2 of them functionally incapable of independent governance. Her political career alone lasted longer than the entire principal reign of virtually any European royal monarch of the 17th century. She ran the empire through 3 sultans, not as an advisor in the modern sense, but as the functional decision-maker on military appointments, diplomatic communications, and fiscal policy, because the men nominally holding the throne were not equipped to do it themselves. The Kafes had done exactly what its designers intended. It prevented succession wars, and in doing so, it systematically hollowed out the executive capacity of the institution that was supposed to be running the empire. The long-term consequences became militarily visible in the 1680, When the Ottoman Empire began losing territorial initiative it had held for centuries, the 1683 Battle of Vienna, where a massive Ottoman siege of the Habsburg capital was broken by a combined European relief force, is the most commonly cited turning point in the empire's military decline. But the structural problem it revealed was older and deeper than that single battle. After 1603, every major Ottoman military failure becomes in part a story of an institution trying to wage sophisticated warfare, without the kind of executive leadership at the top that the Fratricide era had imperfectly, brutally, but genuinely produced. The empire lost territorial initiative in the 1680, lost it again in the 1690s, lost it again in the 1710, and never found a mechanism to recover it, because the throne was no longer generating the kind of capable, experienced leadership that 6 centuries of raw survival had previously required. There is a serious scholarly debate about whether the abolition of fratricide was the primary cause of Ottoman decline or one factor among many. And the honest answer is that it was one factor among many. The European military revolution after 1650 made warfare dramatically more expensive and technically demanding. The devastating silver and currency crisis of the late 16th century had already weakened Ottoman finances before the Kafes era fully took hold. The simultaneous pressure of fighting the Safavids in the east and the Habsburgs in the west stretched military resources across 2 fronts with depleted revenues. The most defensible position in the current historical literature is that the shift from fratricide to Kafes preserved internal stability at a long-term cost in executive capacity. The cost was real. It compounded over generations. And when the external pressures intensified in the late 17th century, the institution at the center of the empire was no longer capable of responding the way it had for the previous 300 years. The fratricide system was monstrous by any modern moral standard. Executing children to prevent civil war is not a policy anyone would defend today. But on its own terms, within the logic of what it was designed to do, it worked for more than 2 centuries. And the empire that replaced it with something humane and psychologically destructive paid for that reform across the next 300 years of slow territorial contraction, culminating in the final dissolution of 1922. 6 centuries of survival built on one brutal mechanism, and 3 centuries of decline that began the moment they stopped using it. If this made you think differently about how political systems actually survive versus how we are told they survive, there is another video that examines a completely different empire's collapse. One where the historians had the story almost entirely wrong for a century before the physical evidence forced them to reconsider.